Evelyn Harcourt had never been meant for a title, a manor, or a duke. She had been raised to disappear quietly into a life of needlework and polite silence, a life entirely unremarkable. Yet on the grey morning when her mother pressed a trembling kiss against her forehead and stilled the shaking of her gloved hands, she found herself clothed in Arabella's satin and sent toward an estate she had never expected to see. Arabella, radiant, willful, spoilt by admiration, was the daughter promised to the Duke of Blackwell. But Arabella would not go. She claimed love elsewhere, passion elsewhere, a future of her own choosing. And so Evelyn, who had never once spoken back, became the solution. The carriage smelled faintly of lavender sachets and old leather. Rain slid down the windows in fast, nervous trails, blurring the forest into a green, throbbing smudge. Evelyn folded her hands in her lap, trying to quiet her pulse, but it thudded defiantly, as though her heart were determined to betray her fear. Her mother's words clattered in her mind. "This is your duty. You only need to endure the introductions. The engagement will hold. The Duke will not care." But Evelyn had seen her reflection in the mirror before leaving, a pale imitation of the sister who had been trained to shine. The gown hung a touch loose. The pearls felt foreign against her throat. She was a borrowed silhouette, a counterfeit bride. As the wheels cut deep ruts into the sodden path, Evelyn tried to imagine how she might speak if spoken to, how she might keep her chin raised just high enough. Yet shame rose like a tide. She was an offering, not a choice. Her parents had made that brutally clear. "You will do what Arabella refuses," her father had said, each syllable carved from ice. "A Harcourt must honor our agreements." Evelyn wondered if he would miss her should she vanish into the mist curling between the trees. She suspected not. When the carriage lurched to a stop before Blackwell Manor, Evelyn's breath caught. The estate loomed against the storm clouds like a fortress, stone darkened by centuries, windows reflecting flashes of lightning. Servants moved beneath umbrellas, their figures darting with swift purpose. Above them, great columns framed an entrance carved in the shape of climbing roses, beautiful, severe, immovable. Evelyn felt as though every raindrop paused midair to witness her arrival. The coachman opened the door, murmuring encouragement, though his eyes betrayed doubt. Evelyn stepped out, her shoes sinking into wet gravel, her skirts dampening at the hem. A cluster of finely dressed guests lined the stairs, protected beneath the overhang, and their murmurs pricked her skin. She felt their scrutiny travel the length of her borrowed gown, assessing and judging. "That is not Arabella Harcourt," someone whispered, not nearly quietly enough. "Are we to believe the Duke will accept a substitute?" Evelyn's cheeks burned, but she kept her gaze lowered. The rain's drumming drowned her thoughts, but the shame clung, sharp and metallic, as though she had swallowed a blade. She was the family's quiet shame now made visible, their desperation paraded before nobility. Yet she walked forward. At the top of the steps, her gloves sticking faintly from the damp, she paused. A steward announced her name in a voice that echoed beneath the stone arches, a voice that sounded almost disbelieving. "Miss Evelyn Harcourt. Not Lady Harcourt. Not the promised bride. Just Evelyn, standing where she did not belong." Inside, the entrance hall glowed with amber candlelight, flickering across polished marble. Portraits of Blackwell ancestors stared down with austere expressions, as if judging her worth against centuries of lineage. Evelyn tried to steady her breath, but the murmur of voices behind her swelled, speculation, curiosity, amusement. She was certain she would faint. And then, as lightning cracked across the sky outside, she saw him. Duke Sebastian Blackwell stood beneath the great chandelier, his figure half lit, half shadow. Tall, straight-backed, with the austerity of a man who had learned authority before affection. He wore a black coat that sharpened every line of him. He was the kind of presence that silenced rooms without effort. And as Evelyn's trembling form reached the threshold, he lifted his gaze. The moment stretched, quiet, startling, inescapable. His eyes, dark gray like the storm, locked upon hers. The surrounding whispers faded to a hum. Evelyn could not have looked away if she wished to. Something in his expression shifted, a flicker of surprise, yes, but also recognition, though they had never met. As if, impossibly, he had been expecting her rather than Arabella. Evelyn's heartbeat thundered, rearranging the air in her lungs. She felt exposed, but also undeniably seen, as though her soul had stepped forward before her body. The Duke did not speak at first. He simply regarded her with a focus so intense it forced everyone else in the hall to still their curiosity. Even the candles seemed to soften their flames in deference. Finally, his voice carried across the space, cool, resonant, unmistakably certain. "Miss Harcourt," he said, yet his tone imbued the name with a weight no one had ever granted her. "Welcome." Evelyn's knees threatened to buckle. She offered a small curtsy, barely keeping balance. But the hall, primed for ridicule, fell into the shocked hush of spectators watching fate alter course before their eyes. For in the Duke's unwavering gaze, Evelyn understood a truth more terrifying than shame. He had known within that first breath that the wrong sister had been sent. And yet, astonishingly, he did not look away. Evelyn woke the next morning with the heavy knowledge that she was still inside Blackwell Manor, and still wearing a place that had never been hers to claim. Dawn seeped through the tall windows in a wash of gray gold, turning dust motes into drifting constellations. For a moment she let herself imagine Arabella in her place, laughing at the absurdity of duty, commanding the servants with careless confidence. Then reality returned with a tightness in her chest, and she rose to face it. The manor was quieter than she expected. No one had come to escort her, no maid waited outside her door with address or directions. Perhaps they thought she knew how to navigate estates like these. She did not. Still, she left her chamber, counting each step like a trespasser moving through sacred ground. Oil portraits peered from the walls, ladies with regal spines, gentlemen with medals and swords, and she felt them assessing her lineage, measuring and finding her wanting. She found the Duke in the morning gardens, though she had not intended to. She had merely sought air, needing distance from the suffocating expectation brewing in the halls. The gardens were a labyrinth of sculpted hedges, fountains, and roses bowed heavily with dew. A gravel path wound beneath her shoes as she breathed deeply, the damp scent of earth reminding her there were simpler worlds than this. Sebastian was standing beside a sundial, reading a letter with such severity it looked as though the words themselves had insulted him. When he lifted his gaze and saw her, his expression changed, softened, not dramatically, but enough to unsettle her balance. He folded the letter once, slipped it into his coat, and inclined his head. "Miss Harcourt," he greeted, the formal address warmed by a note that almost hinted at invitation. "You rise early." I did not sleep long," she confessed, regretting the truth as soon as it left her lips. She wished she had sounded composed, accustomed, impervious. His eyes flickered with understanding. "Nor I." She knew she ought to excuse herself, but instead she stood beside him, both of them staring at the quiet glow over the gardens as if waiting for the same revelation. The silence was comfortable, astonishingly so. "You like violets?" he asked suddenly. Evelyn blinked. "I beg your pardon?" He nodded toward a patch of them nestled against a marble urn, dark purple, nearly black in the early light. "You looked at them when you stepped outside," he said, "with more interest than anything else in this estate." She flushed. "They remind me of home." He reached into his coat, producing something delicate, a tiny glass pendant, encasing a pressed violet, slender stem and all. "My mother collected these," he explained, his voice gentled by memory. "When I saw you last night, I thought she might have approved of you." The admission hung between them like a living thing. Evelyn stared at the pendant, unable to speak. It felt far too intimate, too meaningful for a girl who was here by mistake. "Your Grace," she whispered, "I cannot accept this." "You already have," he replied, placing it in her open palm. She had not realized she had offered her hand. In the gesture there was no demand, no presumption, only a quiet certainty. She closed her fingers around the glass, feeling its cool surface, and something inside her rearranged. She thought, he should not care. And yet he does. By midday, the entire household seemed to know of it. Servants paused when she passed, their eyes gleaming with rumor. Footmen who had ignored her that morning now bowed too low. She heard fragments as she walked the corridor. The violet! Given personally. No mistaking that intention. Her heart pounded. She wished the Duke had been cold, distant, indifferent. Anything but curious. Anything but kind. The first challenge came from Lady Wentworth, a baroness of sharp bones and sharper judgment, who descended upon Evelyn in the drawing-room like a hawk upon a trembling sparrow. "My dear," she purred, every syllable dipped in disdain, "you must be overwhelmed to find yourself here, in such distinguished company." Evelyn offered a polite smile. "It is certainly an adjustment." "And your sister?" Lady Wentworth continued. "Has she recovered from her unfortunate inability to fulfill her engagement?" Heat crawled up Evelyn's throat. The Baroness wanted blood. "My sister's health is improved," she managed. "I was honored to attend in her stead." "Honored." The Baroness's laugh crackled like snapping twigs. "One would think desperation, not honor, brought you here." Before Evelyn could reply, Sebastian entered the room. The Baroness straightened, her smirk evaporating. He crossed to Evelyn without hesitation, every guest watching. "Miss Harcourt," he said, offering his arm. "Would you join me for luncheon?" Gasps rippled like wind through wheat. Evelyn felt the floor drop beneath her feet. She took his arm because there was nothing else to do, but with every step she heard the murmur build. "She has ensnared him. He has lost his judgment." The wrong sister, indeed. At lunch, she could barely eat. The Duke spoke to her as though she belonged, as though she were his peer, and she responded as gracefully as she could. But beneath it all pulsed a frantic truth. Every kindness he showed tethered her fate more tightly to scandal. When the meal ended and the nobles dispersed to their amusements, Sebastian paused, studying her. "They will speak," he said. "But they spoke before you arrived." Evelyn swallowed. "I do not wish to be the cause of trouble." "You are not," he answered quietly. "They resent anything they do not understand." "Then they misunderstand greatly," she murmured. He touched her elbow with a feather-light hand, as though granting her a choice. "Do you wish to leave?" She looked up, slow and startled. His eyes held no command, only earnest concern. "No," she said, surprising herself. "I do not." The tremor of a smile brushed his lips before he let her go. And as she watched him disappear into the corridor, pendant cool against her skin, Evelyn realized with a dawning ache that she had crossed the threshold from dread into longing. Just as the manor doors opened, and a footman announced a visitor carrying a letter sealed in Arabella's unmistakable script with consequences looming ahead. The storm came without warning, rolling over Blackwell Manor in a heaving mass of black clouds, as though the heavens themselves had decided to bear witness. Thunder cracked across the sky with such force that Evelyn felt it reverberate through the floorboards beneath her feet. She stood in the corridor holding Arabella's letter, her hands trembling not from cold, but from the ink carved like a blade into her heart. "Return at once. You deceive them by merely breathing in that house. Father will handle the consequences, but you must not allow the Duke to imagine you matter." Arabella's familiar hand, elegant and cruel. A command, not a plea. And beneath it, an undertow of resentment so potent Evelyn could taste it. She wanted to flee then, pack her gowns, return to obscurity, surrender the brief shard of belonging she had dared to feel. Yet her feet would not move. Instead, she found herself drifting deeper into the manor, toward the west wing everyone else seemed eager to avoid. The storm rattled the windows in their frames, rain hammering the panes with frantic urgency. Shadows clung to the walls like forgotten ghosts. She found refuge in a deserted music room, where moonlight leaked through diamond-paned glass and dust rose with every breath she took. There was a fireplace, cold but waiting, and she knelt to coax it to life, needing warmth, needing something tangible while her thoughts splintered. The letter lay open on the rug beside her, accusing even in silence. "I do not belong here." The words formed in her mind, steady and undeniable. Even if she wished to stay, even if the Duke's gaze had unsettled something deep within her, she could not pretend. She was not the chosen sister. She was the emergency measure. A counterfeit bride wrapped in misplaced tenderness. A gust of wind slammed a shutter, startling her. Sparks snapped in the hearth. She hugged her arms around herself, suddenly aware of every fragile piece that made up her being. "It is not my fate to be seen," she whispered into the empty room. Saying it aloud did not diminish the ache. She did not hear the door open. Only when a bootstep creaked did she start upright, breath catching painfully. Duke Sebastian stood in the doorway, rain glittering in his hair and on the shoulders of his coat, as if the storm had tried to claim him and failed. "I searched for you," he said, no formal greeting, no cool restraint. Just truth, plain and urgent. Evelyn struggled to compose herself. She rose, smoothing her skirts, but emotion tugged at her voice. "You should not have troubled yourself, Your Grace." He entered, closing the door behind him with a soft click. The room seemed to shrink, the storm outside amplifying the quiet between them. "When Miss Harcourt disappears with a storm at her heels," he murmured, "I find myself quite unable to remain at table." A tremor slipped through her. "I received a letter." "I assumed as much," he replied, his tone sharpening barely. "From your sister?" Silence answered for her. Her glance at the letter scattered on the rug was enough. The Duke took a breath, then stepped closer, each stride deliberate, as though approaching a skittish creature he feared might bolt. "What did she write?" he asked. "Or should I ask what she demanded?" Evelyn shut her eyes. "She says I have no right to be here. That I deceive you simply by allowing you to look at me." Sebastian's jaw tightened. For a heartbeat, thunder filled the space where his words might have been. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and steady. "You have deceived no one." "But I am not Arabella," Evelyn whispered. "I was not prepared for this life, this scrutiny. I came because they told me I must, because our family," she faltered, breath shaking. "I am a replacement, a shadow, and the world knows it." Sebastian moved nearer until only inches separated them, and Evelyn could feel the soft heat radiating from him, warming the chill woven into her bones. "Look at me," he said. She hesitated, then lifted her gaze. His eyes were fierce, storm-lit and clear. "Do you think I do not recognize the difference between obligation and choice?" he asked quietly. "My father arranged the match with Arabella. I agreed because it was expected. But from the instant you crossed that threshold, wet from rain, trembling but proud, I understood I had been offered something neither expected nor deserved." "Something," she breathed, disbelieving. "A chance," he said. A living glimpse of sincerity in a world constructed of display. Evelyn felt her pulse pound in her throat. "I am unremarkable." "You are unforgettable," he answered, no hesitation in his tone. "One look was too brief a lifetime to understand you, and yet too long to ever forget." Her lips parted, air trembling in and out of her lungs. No one had spoken of her like that, not even in dreams. She feared she might shatter beneath the weight of it. "You do not know me," she whispered, because it was the only defense left. His gaze softened, though intensity coiled beneath. "I know enough. I know you carry a burden not of your making. I know you believe duty defines you. And I know," he continued, inching closer, "that if you walk out of this house, I will regret it every day of my life." Lightning flared white against the window. The thunder that followed felt like the world splitting open. Evelyn's breath caught, the storm outside and the storm inside colliding. For a heartbeat, they stood in suspended possibility. His hand lifted, slowly, respectfully, hovering near her cheek, near enough to feel but not touch. She leaned toward it without meaning to, drawn by warmth and promise. "I am afraid," she confessed, the words trembling free. "So am I," he answered. "And yet here we stand." The moment teetered, fragile as glass. Then a pane in the window burst outward, wind and rain crashing through, scattering sparks from the hearth. Evelyn gasped. Sebastian grabbed her hand, pulling her away from the flying shards, his arm a shield around her. When the surge of wind settled and the fire steadied again, they stared at one another, breathless, shaken, bound by something neither could name. Then, muffled through the storm, a voice echoed down the corridor. A servant, frantic, calling the Duke's name. "There has been an arrival," he shouted. "A lady, unannounced." Evelyn's heart stilled. For she knew, before Sebastian turned toward the door, exactly which lady had come. The morning air was brittle, carrying the scent of wet earth and pine, as though the storm had left its mark upon the world and refused to leave. Blackwell Manor hummed with a tense stillness, the halls lined with portraits that seemed to frown down at all who dared to disrupt propriety. Evelyn's pulse drummed unevenly as she descended the grand staircase, each step echoing through the marble void. Today, Arabella had arrived, and with her, the sharp edge of confrontation. The front hall was already crowded with guests who had gathered for the morning assembly. Their faces were masks of curiosity laced with the thrill of impending scandal. Evelyn's gown rustled softly against her legs, heavy silk soaked from the garden dew. Her gloves, meticulously adjusted only moments before, felt suddenly inadequate against the storm brewing indoors. She felt the eyes of society pierce her, dissect her, label her. And she knew that no countenance she could muster would alter the gossip that now danced like a knife through the drawing-room. Arabella entered with all the poise Evelyn had envied for a lifetime. Her hair gleamed like molten chestnut, a crown of perfection atop a face designed to charm without effort. She carried a letter sealed with her family crest, and her glance swept the room as though it were her dominion. She stopped abruptly at the foot of the staircase, eyes locking onto Evelyn's, and a smile, cold and sharp, brushed her lips. "So," she said lightly, almost theatrically, "this is the substitute my family sends in my stead. How quaint." Evelyn's throat constricted. She bowed politely, every muscle taut. "I am honored to attend in my sister's place, Lady Arabella." The Baroness at the far end of the hall snorted, a note of amusement threading through the murmurs of assembled guests. Evelyn felt the heat of shame rise, a tide threatening to drown her, but she kept her chin lifted, forcing herself to meet Arabella's gaze. Sebastian appeared at her side without announcement. His presence was a shield, though it did little to quiet the murmurs. He was dressed in a morning coat of deep charcoal, the cut tailored to his shoulders and chest, commanding attention without a word. He inclined his head slightly toward Evelyn, an assertion of quiet ownership that rippled through the room like a stone tossed into still water. Arabella's expression flickered, something akin to surprise flashing beneath her polished veneer. "I trust your journey was satisfactory?" Sebastian's voice rang through the hall, cool but layered with authority. Evelyn caught the subtle lilt that carried both reproach and care. Arabella's lips parted, a carefully concealed smirk threatening to betray her composure. "It was adequate. But one must wonder why the Duke permits a mere shadow of a bride to occupy the place promised to me." The room stiffened. Whispers spread like fire through dry grass. Evelyn's stomach twisted, but Sebastian did not hesitate. He stepped closer, placing a gloved hand lightly upon Evelyn's elbow. "You misunderstand," he said. "The lady you see before you is no shadow. She is the person I choose." A gasp arose from the assembly. Evelyn's heart pounded in disbelief. She had feared confrontation, humiliation, and scrutiny, yet nothing had prepared her for this declaration, so public, so irrevocable. Arabella's eyes narrowed, and for the first time, she faltered. "Choose her," she repeated, voice tight with incredulity. "But she was never meant for you, never meant to stand in my place. You cannot." Sebastian's gaze was unwavering. "I can," he said simply, and in that moment, the hall seemed to hold its breath. "I will not honor agreements made by convenience. I honor truth." Evelyn felt a strange lightness, as though air long withheld had finally filled her lungs. She had imagined rejection, the inevitability of disgrace, but Sebastian's words cut through every expectation. And yet, doubt lingered, prickling at the edges of her relief. She could not speak for Arabella's intentions, for the persistence of family pressure, for the judgment of society. Arabella's next move was swift and theatrical. She held the letter high, letting the wax crest glint in the candlelight. "Behold the proof of deceit," she announced. "The Harcourts have sent an impostor. She stands here not by merit, but by manipulation. How dare you, Duke, honor this fraud?" The Baroness murmured gleefully. The assembly leaned forward. Evelyn's fingers clenched the fabric of her skirts, nails biting into silk, as all the weight of expectation and shame pressed upon her shoulders. She felt as if the room itself would crush her. Sebastian did not waver. He stepped fully before Evelyn, arms dropping to his sides, posture regal, eyes alight with unassailable resolve. "You are mistaken," he said, voice firm. "This is no fraud. I am aware of her origins, of her family's transgression. Yet she is before me, not as a replacement, but as the only woman I would ever choose." A ripple of astonishment swept through the guests. Evelyn's breath caught. Words formed in her throat but could not emerge. She had lived her life shadowed by Arabella's brilliance, by expectation, by obligation. Yet here, in this hall, the world's opinion could not touch her. Sebastian's declaration had carved a sanctuary, if only for a moment. Arabella's composure cracked then, ever so slightly. Her lips trembled. You cannot mean this," she said, though the tightness in her voice betrayed a truth she could not suppress. "I do," Sebastian said, deliberately slow, every syllable a hammer against society's rigid walls. "I chose her the first time she entered my home, the first glance that revealed the courage, dignity, and spirit denied in mere expectation. I choose her still." The room erupted in whispers, scandal riding each syllable like a wave. Evelyn felt her knees weaken, but she did not retreat. Sebastian's hand brushed hers, subtle yet grounding, as though transferring the weight of his conviction. She lifted her chin, meeting Arabella's eyes. "It is not deceit, Lady Arabella," she said softly. "It is choice. I accept him, not because of my family, but because of truth." Arabella turned sharply, huffing a breath that was half fury, half disbelief. She fled the room, the letter dropping to the floor with a whisper of paper against marble. The Baroness followed, muttering scandalized comments, leaving Evelyn and Sebastian in the sudden hush. He exhaled, a long, quiet sound, and his hand lingered against hers, warmth seeping through the gloves. "You have done what I could not command," he said, eyes dark and intense. "You stood and claimed the right to be yourself." Evelyn's lips curved, tentative but genuine, as she felt the first bloom of something she had never dared to name. Pride intertwined with relief, fear softened by belonging. She began, but the words faltered before the storm of applause and murmurs that rippled back through the hall. The Duke smiled faintly, almost tenderly, and led her to a window where the rain had softened to gentle mist. Outside, the gardens glimmered with silver, the world washed anew. "Society will talk," he murmured, as though reading her thoughts, "but we need not heed it. Here, now, you are not a replacement. You are the only choice that matters." Evelyn felt her chest lift with unexpected buoyancy, her fingers brushing the pendant he had given her. She looked up at him, eyes wide, heart unsteady, and for the first time believed that perhaps, in this tumultuous world. The morning sun rose pale and hesitant over Blackwell Manor, gilding the frost with a tentative glow. Evelyn stood at the drawing-room window, hands folded, heart pounding with anticipation and dread. The letter Arabella had left the day before remained clutched in her fingers, though its edges had softened from constant handling. She had read it countless times, each phrase a reminder of how fragile her claim to dignity and love truly was. Arabella had threatened public exposure, insinuated scandal, and reminded Evelyn that the Harcourt name had never carried the weight of nobility. Yet Evelyn had endured. She had survived the storm of whispers, the glare of society, and the audacity of her own self-doubt. A carriage rolled up the gravel drive, black wheels slicing through frost and morning mist. The sound made Evelyn's chest constrict. She had expected it, yet the sight of it brought a tremor of fear. The driver opened the door, and a footman extended a hand, carrying a folded note sealed with Sebastian's crest. Evelyn's breath caught. The Duke had arrived, unannounced, unbidden by propriety, yet commanding as ever. She descended the staircase, silk brushing the steps in soft, deliberate waves. In the hall, the house felt suspended in anticipation, the portraits of stern ancestors seeming to lean forward in silent scrutiny. As she reached the foyer, Sebastian appeared. He stepped from the carriage himself, coat dusted with frost, hair damp from the morning dew. The wind tousled it, and the morning sun caught the silver threading through his dark locks. His eyes, gray, storm-lit, unfathomable, fixed upon her, and in that moment Evelyn realized she had never truly seen him, never truly understood the gravity of the man who had chosen her over all expectation. "Evelyn," he said, voice low but carrying across the silent hall. "You have endured far more than anyone could have asked. Today, no one may dictate your place but yourself." She met his gaze, her own eyes wide, trembling, and for the first time allowed herself to believe she was no longer merely a substitute. "Your Grace," she murmured, her voice barely above the wind whispering through the window, "I do not know if I deserve." "Deserve." His tone was gentle, though sharp enough to cleave through every doubt. He approached her, each step measured, deliberate, like a king moving toward the crown he was certain belonged to no one else. "You are not here to deserve anything. You are here because I choose you. Not by accident, not by obligation, but because of who you are. Your courage, your heart, your truth, these are yours alone, and they command more than any title or expectation ever could." Evelyn felt warmth pool beneath her ribs, spreading to her fingertips. Her chest rose and fell with sudden, shaky strength. She wanted to speak, to protest, to utter 1,000 denials, but words would not suffice. All she could do was step closer. The door to the hall burst open, and Arabella appeared, a final act of defiance or desperation. It was impossible to tell. Her gown gleamed like polished mahogany, her hair a cascade of carefully arranged perfection, but her eyes betrayed panic, a fragile panic that matched the storm of yesterday. "You cannot," she said sharply, voice tight with fury. "He was promised to me. This is wrong. A scandal, a disgrace to both our families." Sebastian did not flinch. He took Evelyn's hand, gloved and pale, and raised it with deliberate grace. "No," he said firmly. "The only disgrace would be to ignore truth. Arabella, the engagement was arranged, yes, but it was not my heart you commanded. The woman I choose stands before me, and no accusation, no letter, no societal decree shall alter that." Arabella's lips parted, then pressed into a thin line. She faltered, the room holding its collective breath as the finality of Sebastian's declaration settled. The Baroness at the edge of the hall, ever eager for disruption, clicked her fan with a sharp rhythm, but even she could not mask the awe that passed through the assembly. Evelyn's fingers tightened around Sebastian's, and in that touch she felt the culmination of every small, quiet triumph. The endurance of whispered slights, the courage of standing visible when the world expected her to shrink, the reclamation of her own worth. "I accept you," she said, voice clear, unwavering now. "Not for convenience, not for compliance, but because I choose as well." Sebastian's expression softened, and for the first time in her life, Evelyn allowed herself to notice the subtle lines of exhaustion beneath his composed exterior, the hint of vulnerability beneath his commanding poise. "Then let us begin," he said, and the single phrase carried the weight of vows, of futures, of defiance against expectation. Arabella turned, lips pressed tight, and left the hall without another word. The letter she had delivered now lay abandoned on the marble floor, unread, powerless. The assembly remained hushed, a moment suspended in time as if the Manor itself had paused to acknowledge the triumph of choice over decree. Sebastian led Evelyn to the great window that overlooked the gardens, where the frost had melted in soft rivulets, sparkling like liquid diamonds in the rising sun. He reached for the pendant he had given her days before, the pressed violet encased in glass, and handed it back. "For remembrance," he said softly, "of the day we claimed truth over obligation." Evelyn held it, feeling the weight of both fragility and permanence, and pressed it to her chest. "I will remember," she whispered. "Every moment, every choice." They stood in silence for a long moment, the world outside washed anew by the storm's retreat, the air crisp with possibility. Evelyn realized she had never known such clarity, such certainty. She had arrived a substitute, trembling and unseen, yet she now stood here as her own person, recognized, chosen, valued. Sebastian inclined his head, a tender smile brushing his lips. "Shall we announce it?" he asked, though the declaration had already been made. "Shall we show them the woman who is no longer a shadow?" Evelyn nodded, courage blooming fully now, radiant against the lingering tension in the hall. Together, they descended the staircase, hand in hand, each step deliberate, echoing through the marble corridors as if every footfall were a mark of victory. Guests whispered, some in astonishment, others in admiration, But no words could diminish the certainty that now enveloped them both. In the grand hall, Sebastian raised his voice, rich and unwavering. "Ladies and gentlemen, the Duke has spoken, but I shall make it clear. Miss Evelyn Harcourt is no substitute, no shadow, and no compromise. She is the woman I choose, and henceforth, she shall be acknowledged as the Duchess in her own right." The room seemed to inhale, the sound of his declaration folding into the walls, embedding itself into the very structure of Blackwell Manor. Evelyn's heart leapt. The weight of expectation and history, of family and society, had finally shifted. She was seen, recognized, and exalted not by title alone, but by merit, spirit, and choice. Sebastian bent slightly, a gesture as intimate as it was defiant, and Evelyn allowed herself to step close, resting her hand against his chest. They did not need witnesses. Their eyes spoke volumes that echoed louder than any applause or whispered scandal. And as the morning light spilled across the frost-glimmering gardens, Evelyn realized with a sense of awe that she had crossed from shadow into radiance, from substitution into sovereignty over her own fate. And yet, even in triumph, the air shimmered with possibility. Every whisper that had sought to diminish her now challenged her to carry forward with dignity. Evelyn pressed the glass-encased violet to her lips and whispered, not to anyone but to herself, "I am no one's replacement. I am mine." Sebastian's hand found hers again, fingers entwining, and he murmured, "And I am yours." For the first time, Evelyn believed it with all her heart. The world might watch, society might chatter, but in that room, in that moment, there was only certainty, only truth, only love that had been fought for and won. And as the sun climbed higher, gilding the frost and spilling warmth across the manor, Evelyn looked up at Sebastian, and the faintest, most radiant smile curved her lips. She had entered the world as a substitute, trembling and unseen, yet she would leave it as the only choice that had ever mattered.